Hello Internet. This week we are going to talk about MBAs, and this is a little special to my heart. So I want to start with a story, and then we'll get into the book and then some thoughts I had in the book. So MBA programs, Masters of Business Administration. Most undergraduates like myself that get some sort of degree in honestly any degree, they always are somewhat enticed by going to get an MBA in the MBA program because they feel like that these credentials will open many more doors for them. And I was lucky after my undergraduate degree to actually have a job lined up right after graduating, so I didn't have to necessarily dive right into an MBA immediately. And the job was actually based in St. Louis, Missouri, and I actually decided to lease an apartment near a university that had a quote-unquote prestigious MBA, and that was Washington University in St. Louis. And when I first moved there, I decided to actually attend some of the administration recruiting kind of meetings. So I wanted to get a feel for, is this worth it? Is there a good education? Is like the credentials worth it? Is the cost worth it? And will I get something out of this? Now, when I attended this kind of recruitment meeting, the administrators, the deans, and they also had some alumni there basically talking about the curriculum, the benefits that come with doing a program like that, the network that you build, but also the cost, and then they talked about some other things. And after attending that, I asked tons of questions, but I actually pulled aside some of the alumni as well and asked them a lot of questions. And then I actually poked my head in a few lectures that were happening at that moment in time when I went to visit. I realized actually after attending that recruitment meeting and doing a bit of research around MBA programs in general, not just there, but all over the place. And I came to the conclusion that really what they're selling you at a high price, which you're basically you're putting yourself in a lifetime of debt for credentials. All you're doing is getting credentials and not much education. And the credentials are basically a ticket to play the game. And that game is usually a very niche game for not many people. And the niche game could be kind of big corporate consulting or investment banking or something along those lines. But I wasn't fully convinced, or fully against it, so I decided to actually do a little research on my own. So while working at the corporation I was at, which is MasterCard, I reached out to a bunch of quote-unquote higher-up executives in the company, but also outside of the company, other companies, because I didn't want to have a biased kind of subset of statistics, right? So I kind of informally interviewed all these people, asking them a bunch of questions, but some of the questions I asked were oriented around MBAs. So I wanted to know basically, is it worth it? Is it worth it to basically put myself in a lifetime of debt to get an MBA, to have the credential? Will it help me, quote unquote, succeed and go up the ladder faster in the corporation? And it was surprising to me that probably over 80% of the people that I talked to, and I talked to probably around 25 people, they almost all of 80% of them said basically an MBA is useless. There's no reason to get an MBA. You should basically redirect that energy and that urge for learning and put it directly into your job and other jobs that you're taking, not just in this company, but other companies, because you can learn so much more outside of an MBA program and do a lot of supplemental learning for the theory stuff through books, just reading. So after having that conversation with them, after attending this kind of recruitment meeting at this university, I came to the conclusion that I didn't want to get an MBA. And I did a bit more research around the educational system in general and my own experience. And this is probably not a popular opinion amongst some of the people that might see this. But I came to the conclusion that MBAs are almost pointless. They're almost useless, and it's a waste of money. And the reason being is that, at least in the curriculum that I've come across in the universities I've read about, which are some of the more prestigious ones like Wharton and Harvard, and apparently it's the Washington University place is pretty prestigious. If you actually go through the curriculum and even watch some of the lectures, a lot of it's case study based. So a lot of it's based off of examples, and they put this up on a pedestal and kind of promote it and say we're a case study oriented curriculum, so we're putting you in real world examples. But the thing is, a lot of what they're learning is just approximations and heuristics that are helpful, but they're not context specific, and they're also not teaching the fundamentals of business. So they're not teaching you how to create, start, and operate a business from scratch. And they're just kind of jumping straight into kind of quantitative analysis and financial statements and kind of playing really heavy on the numbers and not really on the fundamentals. So after learning this kind of hard lesson of realizing that this isn't something I wanted to do, I wanted to learn what an MBA would learn and more, hopefully. So I kind of created my own personal MBA when I was in St. Louis for about 1.5 years, 2 years. And instead of reading business books, because I read probably 6 or 7 business books in the first few months I was there, and I was kind of completely anti-business books after that. I was completely off-put. So I decided to actually kind of reverse engineer and break down what a business is made of and all the different subsets of it. So I've kind of looked into different books that would kind of boost your intelligence in those areas. So for instance, finance and investing, I read a few books in that. For leadership, I didn't read any leadership books. I read a lot of biographies of people that were great leaders in history. For marketing and sales, I read a few psychology books around kind of persuasion, etc. And for operations, I read a few operations books, but actually I focused more on complex systems and how complex systems function and how the subsystems within those systems actually create emergent properties from those. When going through this kind of personal curriculum and creating all this stuff, I came across one book that I actually was impressed by, and it was a business book. It was one of the first 6 or 7 that I read when I first got there, and it's called the Personal MBA. And the reason I like this book, and I actually revisited it recently, and that's the book that we went into this week, was the Personal MBA. And the reason I revisited it is because I enjoyed it so much, and it's a holistic book around basically trying to synthesize and condense down all the fundamentals of business within a single textbook. And obviously that's kind of impossible. So what he does instead is he kind of pulls out a lot of the 80-20 rule. So 20% of what you learn kind of creates 80% of the results. So he basically condenses down a bunch of different areas of business, so finance, marketing, sales, operations, etc., and then kind of pulls out all the jargon and the terminology that's relevant, and then he sends out a lot of additional resources for you to go and research in those areas. So I decided to revisit this book this week because I wanted to kind of brush up on my understanding of what makes a successful business and how I redefine successful. And like always, I'm not going to regurgitate the entire post, but I highly recommend you go read the post if you're interested in seeing kind of more about how I feel about this and what I derived from the book. But what I decided to do when I wrote in the post was to kind of pull out some of the insights I got from the book on this second revisiting, and also kind of add in a bit of insights from the barrage of books I've read previously, and also the 5.5 or 6 years of experience of corporation business stuff up to today. And there's really kind of just 3 things I'll touch on here, and then you can go to the post for the rest. So the first is business isn't really that complicated, like most topics. So most topics are intellectualized, or they're made complex for not very good reasons. Or the person that's working in the space doesn't have really the ability to simplify the topic to a wider audience. And when researching business, it can get quite overwhelming if you don't necessarily know what you're looking for, because there is a lot of complex jargon that people will kind of knock you off your stool with. And if you think about a business and you basically synthesize it down to its fundamental pieces, to like its very kind of bare bones essence, a business really does like 4.5 things, right? To create or run a business. So the half piece is before you actually start the process. So that's like the preparation. The preparation piece is basically making sure whatever you're providing to people is wanted by the people. So this is doing market research, this is doing shadow testing and different types of analysis to make sure there's a good product market fit. So that's like jargony stuff. But basically what you're trying to do is you're saying, before I spend a bunch of money on this product or service that I'm going to create, I need to make sure people are going to put their money up for it. So you do a lot of kind of assumption busting in yourself and questioning all your assumptions based on what you think is going to work. The second thing is really kind of the start of the process, which is creation. So the 4 I've kind of thought up are creation, communication, distribution, and operation. So I'm sure I know there's tons of stuff that's not included in these, but these are kind of like the big pillars, right? And you can kind of bundle everything else up within it. And if you think about creation, so creation, we'll start with that one. So creation is basically the design, the development, and the testing of a product or a service. So you're creating something, iterating through multiple iterations of the design to make sure whatever you're creating fits the assumptions and fits the wants of the people that are putting up their money previously. Marketing or communication basically is marketing and branding. So once you create this cool thing, then you need to figure out a way to get people to know about it, right? So that's really around the psychology of how humans work and why they want what they want. But the important thing that I've realized, and everybody should know, is that to do this, you have to do it in the morally right way, because most people know if you're trying to kind of cop them out. So don't try to market something that you don't necessarily believe in or you think is actually going to provide value to someone. Because if you don't, then you're just going to waste your time and someone else's money. The next one is distribution. So this is kind of a combination between sales and actually getting the thing out to the people. So sales for me has always been kind of a touchy subject, because I've never been necessarily interested in sales, because I've always had a bad taste in my mouth from the concept of sales. But over time, I've realized that if you're selling something that you genuinely believe in, it's not really sales. It's more of education. You're basically educating someone on how to make good decisions, and if they're going to make a good decision, it could be for your product or not for your product, because I've actually told people not to buy certain things on behalf of big deals. And the other thing is actually getting the product out to people. So that's basically the value delivery or the distribution channel. Like, how do you get this product or service out to the person that purchased it? And the last one is operations. And this is one that people actually miss quite often. And when they miss it or they overlook it is because they either don't think it's sexy enough to focus on, or they've just overlooked it. And operations, I've realized, is probably one of the most important pieces of all of this, because a lot of what happens is people sell these products or services to people, and they don't put enough thought into actually automating the operations and making checklists for critical situations. So by not going through this and kind of like really analyzing and observing the operations of a business, the owner, the executives, the leaders, etc., they have to put so much time and energy into it. But if you actually put a lot of upfront observation and recording and really methodically going through how processes work, you can actually extract yourself out of that and not really do much, and the business can run without you. And that's another really important piece. So that's business. I mean, there's a lot more you can do, but in a nutshell, in its essence, that's what it is. So the next thing, and kind of when thinking about, when reading this book and going through this book and writing about this, was entrepreneurship, so creating businesses. There's a lot that I could say about this, but I'm not going to say much because that would be an entire kind of thing on its own. The only two things I want to point out here with entrepreneurship is two myths that have been busted for me that I wish I would have been busted in the past. So the first is that to be an entrepreneur, you don't have to be magical, you don't have to be special, you don't have to be some sort of like unicorn individual. And the other one is bootstrap as much as possible, right? So the first one is an entrepreneur. So when we think of entrepreneurs, we tend to think of people that are like Renaissance women and men, people that know so much or that are so courageous and brave. But to run a business really isn't that risky if you know what you're doing, and if you really do a lot of thinking beforehand. And the other interesting thing about this is if you're a fan of history, you'll realize that the concept of entrepreneur is very new in human history. Pre-industrial era, before the Industrial Revolution, when everybody became specialized and relied upon our income on factories to work for them, everybody was basically an entrepreneur. In some way, shape, or form, they were selling something to someone in their market or village. So it's interesting how we've kind of put this whole concept of entrepreneur on a pedestal, and sometimes fear it or think it's too risky or too hard. The other thing is funding, so getting investments. I'm sure you know this as much as I do, but the idea of people raising funding for a company that doesn't necessarily need it has become is too prominent within social media and mainstream news outlets. It's right now everybody wants to make money somehow, some way, so they're basically going to a lot of venture capitalists, raising a ton of money and trying to grow as quickly as possible. I don't feel that that's a good reflection of most businesses. Basically what we're doing is we're putting a spotlight on a small minority of people that are making businesses and trying to scale to 1 billion users and ignoring profits. In my opinion, I think most people should bootstrap forever. Bootstrap meaning that they take no money from outside people, and the only person they should take outside money from is someone that they can easily pay back, and there aren't really too many onerous obligations to them. And with that bootstrap, you basically take a mentality of always having to think about the long-term effects of your business and making profits instead of just basically spending a ton of money and not necessarily thinking about the ramifications of spending that money in the future or giving away ownership of your business. And the last thing I want to talk about is turtles. So in this book, there was a quote, I don't have it here right now, but basically he talks about the world needs more turtles and less tigers. in the sense of business. And what I took from this and from my previous experience and other readings, there's a long list of companies that have lasted 100 to 125 years or more. And the reason these companies tend to last this long are a variety of reasons, but one of the things that stands out to me most is the kind of generational mentality. When people start these companies, they think of them in generations. Like, I'm going to create this company and I'm going to pass it on to my kids, and I expect those to pass it on to their kids. And they're thinking of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 generations down the line for this organization. So a lot of the decisions that they make aren't for short-term profits, and they're not for short-term benefits of themselves. They're thinking of the really, really long term. So by doing that, they're making their business more resilient. So they're thinking, okay, if I play through all these scenarios, what are the worst case situations that can happen today that I can prepare myself and have a lot of buffer when it comes to finances, as well as resources, as well as strategic kind of positioning, etc. for your business. So instead of being another statistic with businesses that last like 10 to 15 years on average today, I think having a turtle mentality, slow and steady wins the race, and a generational kind of focus on your business is an interesting mentality to me, and something that I would like to approach for something that I create. So with that, I've said a lot here. Check out the post, go to the newsletter if you're interested, and I'll see you next week.